Above-ground replacement tank installation video. This video provides general guidelines for the installation of above-ground oil tanks. NORA recommends that manufacturers' instructions and all applicable codes and regulations be diligently followed when installing oil heat equipment. Advance work. Professional tank installations start well before the tank arrives at the job site. By the time the installer arrives to put in the tank, the following should have taken place. A company representative has visited the site, explained all of the options that are available, especially the advantages of inside installations, and help the customer choose the right tank and the best location. The representative has made sure that the tank would fit into the area where it will be installed. Check that a suitable, strong, stable, solid foundation, such as a poured concrete floor, is available. Ensured that the installation would meet all applicable regulations, and verified that a delivery can be safely made. Any necessary permits have been secured. The correct tank has been ordered, received, inspected, and approved. A tank delivered with only a coat of primer has been painted. An electrostatically painted tank has been touched up at the shop in advance of the installation day. In cold weather, the tank has been moved inside a warmed area one day before the installation to make sure that any ice inside the tank has melted. Loading and transportation. The installation crew's job begins when they inspect the tank before loading it onto their vehicle. Minor dents and scratches may be acceptable, but if the tank has substantial damage, it should not be installed. The tank should be drained of any water buildup at this time. And the bottom outlet cap reinserted to protect the threads. Once the crew is satisfied that the tank is in good shape, they can move it to their vehicle by carrying it or strapping it to a hand truck. Tank should never be dragged or walked. Once in the vehicle, the tank should be protected and secured to avoid damage during transport to the job site. The crew should also make sure that they have the correct materials in sufficient quantities for the installation. Fill and vent pipes are typically Schedule 40 steel pipe connected with malleable fittings. Cast fittings that are used with steam systems can be easily broken and must not be used when piping oil tanks. Depending on the type of tank and local codes in effect, the fill may be 2-inch and the vent 1 1/4 inch, or fill and vent might be the same size. In addition to the steel pipe, the crew will need coated copper tubing for the oil supply line, secondary containment for the underground oil line, a vent alarm, a tank gauge, vent and fill caps, cement, caulking, pipe joint compound, and assorted fittings, flanges, nipples, valves, and plugs. Installations vary depending on whether the tank is installed inside or outside the premises. Let's look at an inside installation first. Work area preparation and disconnecting the old tank, inside installation. Once the crew arrives at the job site, they should check the area the tank will have to be moved through and the installation site itself. Although the area should have already been checked, it's important to double-check to make sure the tank will fit and be in compliance with applicable codes before beginning the installation. The work area and any living areas that the crew will be traveling through should be protected to avoid damage and simplify cleanup. The tank should be gently moved from the truck. Tank should never be pushed or dropped. Whenever possible, the new tank should be brought into the area where it will be installed. It's advisable to bring in the new tank before beginning to dismantle the old tank, just in case there's a problem that might delay the installation. If there's not enough room for both tanks, measurements and clearances should be double-checked before the old tank is disconnected. The tank valve should be closed. The heating system should be turned off. And any oil remaining in the old tank should be removed and properly disposed of. Pump overs should be avoided. The transfer of oil containing biological contaminants and sludge from the old tank causes most premature failures of steel tanks. The oil line or lines, fill and vent pipes should be disconnected, safely drained, and properly disposed of. Old oil lines should not be reused with a new tank. Once the old tank is empty and all attached piping has been disconnected, all tapping should be plugged. The tank should then be wrapped in plastic or other protective material to prevent damage to the customer's property as it's removed from the premises for proper disposal. Setting the tank in place, inside installations. The installers now clean the tank area to clear away any debris which can disguise or absorb a leak. And insert the tank legs into the leg supports of the new tank. For a typical 275-gallon tank, these are typically 10 1/2-inch nipples at the outlet end and 12-inch nipples at the other end to provide a minimum 1/4 inch per foot slope toward the outlet and leave sufficient space for the oil valve and filter. The nipples can be fitted with flanges to improve stability. The oil shutoff valve is put in the closed position, coated with approved pipe joint compound, and inserted into the tank. The tank is carefully brought to an upright position. And any minor scratches are repaired. The new tank is moved into place and inserted into a leak detection tray, leaving a minimum 2-inch clearance on all sides for inspection. The greater the clearance, the easier the maintenance. While installing the tank in a tray is not mandatory or required by code, it is considered to be a best practice when installing new tanks. The tank should be installed so that the welded seam is accessible for easy inspection. The seam should not be placed against a wall. The installers verify that the tank is at least 5 feet from any fuel-fired appliance before beginning to pipe the tank in place. The legs are then adjusted using a level to provide at least a 1/4 inch slope toward the outlet. Place a receptacle under the outlet and open the valve to be sure all water is drained. We're now ready to begin piping the new tank. Piping the tank, inside installations. Remove all protective caps, even for tappings not being used, by puncturing them with a screwdriver and pulling them out. They should not be pushed into the tank. All fittings will be made tight using approved pipe joint compound. Teflon tape should not be used. The fill pipe is connected to the top of the tank. And an optional ground joint union is installed to facilitate piping. Swing joints are used to provide a minimum of 1% downward pitch toward the tank to avoid traps. The pipe is run to the outside of the premises where it terminates close to the building in a spill-proof fitting at least 3 feet above ground level and 2 feet from any building openings. The vent alarm or combination vent alarm tank gauge is installed in the tank. The vent pipe is then connected, again with a ground joint union and with swing joints for a downward pitch toward the tank, to the outside where it terminates in an approved weatherproof cap, next to and 6 inches higher than the fill pipe. It should be at least 2 feet from any building openings and at least 5 feet from any flue gas outlet or appliance air inlet. Once the fill and vent piping has been completed, one of the installers caulks the inside and outside areas where the pipes pass through the building. With a properly pitched tank, the fill and vent pipes will appear to be slightly crooked. This is normal. If a combination vent alarm gauge was not used, the tank gauge is installed, and the installer manually checks to be sure it operates properly. Any unused openings are plugged. The installers notify their company that they are ready for a delivery to be made. If a delivery will not be made when the tank is installed, the fill pipe should be tagged with a notice indicating that the tank should not be filled unless a qualified service technician is present to witness the first fill and take care of any situations that may arise. Installing the oil lines, inside installations. A new oil filter is installed at the tank. And an optional oil safety valve is strongly recommended to prevent the tank from siphoning. If an OSV is used, it must be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. A new oil line is now run as directly as possible from the tank to the oil burner, following the piping recommendations of the fuel unit manufacturer. For most installations, 1/2 inch OD piping is preferred. The line must be a minimum of 3/8 inch OD. If copper tubing is buried in or comes directly in contact with concrete, it must be corrosion resistant and should be installed in approved secondary containment. All copper tubing connections must be visible, accessible, and made tight with flare fittings. Compression fittings must not be used. Oil lines should be fastened in place to avoid accidents and damage. If there are multiple oil burners, individual lines should be run from the tank to each burner. It is not a good practice for 2 or more oil burners to share an oil line. In some situations, the oil line is run overhead to the oil burner instead of along the floor. This might cause the fuel unit to occasionally become airbound and lose its prime. In these situations, Oil deaerators can be used to eliminate air from the oil line before it reaches the fuel unit. These deaerators allow the fuel unit to operate as a two-pipe, self-priming unit, even though there is just one line coming from the tank. At the burner, the oil line is connected to a fusible valve, either in the fuel pump or before a secondary filter. When the oil truck arrives, the installer observes the tank and piping while the tank is filled to capacity and tells the delivery person to stop immediately if there's a problem. Proper vent whistle and tank gauge operation are verified at this time. If no deficiencies are found, the oil valve is opened and the oil line is bled. If overhead oil lines have been run from the tank and a deaerator is not installed, the following procedure should be used to purge air from the overhead line. Close the valve at the tank. Open the bleeder valve. Turn on the burner and install a jumper across the FF terminals after the burner starts to keep the unit from going off on safety. If the control does not have accessible FF terminals, put it in the pump priming mode. Once the vacuum reaches 20 inches, open the tank valve and the air will be purged out through the bleeder. Close the bleeder. Once the air has been completely purged, the burner is adjusted and a full efficiency test is performed. At least 15 minutes after the delivery is complete, the installer again checks the tank and piping for leakage, paying particular attention to seams and fittings. Work area preparation and disconnecting the old tank, outside tanks. There are several additional factors that must be considered when installing outside tanks, including setbacks from property lines, typically 5 feet for 275-gallon tanks and 10 feet for tanks up to 660 gallons. Any required setbacks from other fuel tanks. Tanks must not block building entrances or windows. Tanks should be positioned so that they will not be subject to falling ice, snow, dripping water, or other sources of corrosion. Tanks must be properly secured to a rigid base, preferably a concrete pad, to prevent shifting, settling, or tipping over. Protecting the tank if it is installed in an area exposed to vehicular traffic. Protect the tank with anchoring, capable of withstanding 2,200 pounds of upward thrust if it is being installed in an area subject to flooding or high winds. Setting the tank in place, outside tanks. Outside tanks often have the oil drawn from the top of the tank, so the bottom tapping is fitted with either a plug or a machine valve that's been plugged. Piping the tank, outside tanks. Most outside tanks have the fill and vent pipes connected directly into the top of the tank. Unions and swing joints are not normally used unless the tank is being installed in an enclosure. The fill pipe or a plug tapping should be positioned at the low end of the tank to facilitate pump outs for water removal. Installing the oil lines, outside tanks. Oil can be drawn from the tank in one of two ways. A double tap bushing is installed into the tank and the lines are run through it and terminate approximately 2 inches from the tank bottom. Or a floating suction line is installed to draw oil from the upper level in the tank to reduce the possibility of sediment, debris, or heavy particles being drawn into the line. If the tank will be subject to frost heaving and/or movement, the line should have a horizontal loop before entering the building. Rigid pipe should have a swing joint in place of a loop. Outside oil lines should be insulated. A shutoff valve, a new oil filter, and an optional OSV are installed inside where the oil lines enter the building. One of the oil lines should be connected to the valve. The other should be connected to a plug and reserved for future use unless there are multiple oil burners, in which case individual lines should be run from the tank to each burner. The outside tank we've just shown is installed without a cover, leaving the tank unprotected from the elements. There are a number of protective covers currently available that not only shelter the tank, but also make the installation better looking and more professional. Let's face it, oil tanks are not exactly attractive, and a rusty outside tank doesn't help the image of our industry. We highly recommend that outside tanks be installed in one of these enclosures, and that the manufacturer's installation instructions for both the tank and the enclosure are carefully followed. Outdoor tanks, even those that are protected inside an enclosure, are subject to environmental factors that do not affect inside tanks. Outdoor tanks should be installed in such a way that the effects of these environmental factors are reduced. For example, it's normally better to locate a tank in the shade where direct sunlight won't cause excessive condensation, in a location that minimizes the effects of dripping water or falling icicles, away from vehicular traffic. Except for the differences we've just seen, outside and inside tank installations are very similar. Cleanup and paperwork for both outside and inside installations. At this time, the work area is cleaned, and all debris is placed in a receptacle and brought back to the shop for proper disposal. Tools and equipment are returned to their place in the service truck. The installers advise the customer that the area around the tank should be kept clean and explain the importance of keeping the path to the fill pipe clear. They also explain that the tank is the customer's responsibility. It should be checked periodically, and any drips or odors require immediate attention. All paperwork is completed, and any appropriate copies are left with the customer. The installers take one last look around before they leave to verify that there are no leaks or discrepancies and that they've removed all of their tools and equipment. You've just seen the installation of an above-ground oil tank. Proper tank installation is just the beginning. To assure that oil heat customers have an ample supply of fuel safely stored on their property, we must visually inspect the tank on a regular basis and correct any deficiencies found before they have the opportunity to cause problems. NORA recommends 3 levels of inspection. An initial inspection of each tank before your company fills it for the first time. An inspection during each heating system tune-up. And a brief inspection before each delivery. The importance of testing for and removing water cannot be overstated. It prolongs the life of the tank and reduces service calls. Correctly installing and maintaining oil tanks is in everyone's best interest: the customers, your companies, and your own. Local codes and regulations must always be followed when installing oil heat equipment. There are too many ordinances and regulations in effect in various municipalities for us to address them all. If this video recommends a practice that violates local codes in your area, remember that the local authority having jurisdiction has the final say, and its regulations must be followed.